All right, so we finished sodium, potassium, and they were super important. So let's get through these guys really quickly. So calcium is next. We'll look at calcium. Okay, so our blood calcium levels should be 9 to 10.5 milligrams per deciliter. And right off the bat, you're probably familiar with calcium. We talk about it a lot, about calcium, build strong bones. So I'm going to draw like a little, just like a bone. I'm not very good at drawing these, I'm sorry. Okay, so that's our bone. So we got to think about calcium, we're worried about our bones. Another thing about calcium is it works with phosphorus and magnesium. So we're going to talk about calcium first, and then it's going to have a lot to do with phosphorus and magnesium. Still reading from our overview, we keep calcium stored mostly in our bones. But it goes beyond that. So calcium is important for our bone strength. But also for activating enzymes. That sounds important. Activating enzymes. Allowing skeletal and cardiac muscle contraction. Wow. Okay. Where does that sound like it's going to be a problem? If it affects muscle contraction? Yikes. Controlling nerve impulse transmission. Oh my gosh, nerves again. And allowing blood clotting. Y'all did not know that calcium was this important, did you? Because I did not before I learned all this. So muscles, nerves, blood clotting, activating enzymes. Literally so important. Fun fact. For us to make use of calcium, we need vitamin D. So we need with vitamin D. Okay. So calcium is stored in the bones, and when we need more, we have hormones that help transfer it from the bones into the blood. And that hormone is parathyroid hormone, PTH. PTH, and that increases calcium in the blood. And then we have a second hormone, which is called thyrocalcitonin. So they're going to make me write this out. Thyrocalcitonin, or TCT, which causes plasma calcium levels to decrease. So it decreases calcium in the blood. So calcium is our regulator for our enzymes, our muscle contraction, our nerves, our blood clotting. It's regulating that. So what happens when it's low is, so the regulation is off. So we're going to hear our patients complaining about muscles and nerves because that's something that they can really, sense pretty quickly. So we're going to start by seeing some neuromuscular changes. We'll be hearing from our patients some tingling, some numbness. If it's worse, we might get to the point where we're seeing muscle twitching or painful cramps. And so the biggest thing for when we're assessing calcium is these specific tests. And so for those tests, it's probably going to be the really only thing that I draw out for this one. So the first one that's most popular is Chvostek sign. Chvostek. So Chvostek, CHVOSTEK, and I probably didn't say that right because honestly, I've only ever called it Chewy's sign because it starts with the CH, so Chewy. Chewy as in chew. Because what happens is they start getting this like twitch right on their face when they when you press on their temple. I got a picture on my book. So this is Chewy sign. So to me, he looks like he's chewing. So like Chewy, Chvostek sign, chewing. That's all I really learned it as. So when you touch their face, they end up grimacing. Looks like they're chewing food. Chvostek sign. Okay, and then there's a second one, and it's called Trousseau's sign. So Trousseau's, I remember because their hand looks like it's making a little T. So for Trousseau sign, T. How do you spell trousseau? I'm going to spell this wrong. T-R-O-U-S-S-E-A-U. So trousseau, their arm makes a little T, like it goes on a little tilt. Where is it? Their arm tilts. It goes on a T. So Trostec, they're chewing. Trousseau's arm goes to a T. Okay. So those are going to be really popular and fun common test questions. But some other signs that we're going to see from these patients are going to be cardiovascular changes. Because again, we're seeing that it affects, muscle contraction and regulating those action potentials. So if we start changing our cardiovascular system, that's going to be pretty rough. Some EKG changes. The heart rate might be slower or faster than normal with a weak and thready pulse. Severe hypocalcemia causes severe hypotension. And EKG changes of a prolonged ST interval and a prolonged QT interval. So there are some EKG changes and a weak pulse. So I'm going to draw my little EKG. Boop. QRST. Perfect. That one looks really bad, y'all. I'm sorry. Okay, so it's saying prolonged ST interval. It's saying there's a space right here. Oh, I drew that really small. So everything else is the same, but there's a bigger space between the T and the S. Oh, can y'all even see that? It's fine. Y'all got it. Y'all got my drift. Okay. Intestinal changes include increased peristaltic activity. So we have hyperactive bowel sounds. I'm going to draw everything going crazy. Was that green? Doesn't look green. Okay. Skeletal changes. Calcium leaps bone storage sites, causing a loss of bone density. If they're less dense, they're more brittle, and they might break. Uh-oh. So I'm going to just draw a little red, like broken bone. It's got an X. Broken bone. All right, so intervention, we're going to try and give them calcium. So orally first, and then we go like least invasive to most. But when we give calcium, we also give vitamin D because, again, need it to with vitamin D for it to activate. So a lot of this is going to be nutrition therapy. One last important thing, they are at risk for seizures. So I'm just going to draw a little lightning bolt near their brain. They are at risk for seizures because of that hyperexcitability. So we got to be prepared to reduce some stimulation for them and have some seizure precautions ready to go. Also, some other things, if they have those fragile bones, we got to be careful, especially, if they're having those, brittle bones in association with numb hands and feet, like they're at a fall risk, and then if they fall, they're more likely to break something. So let's be super careful about their fall risk. All right, so that's hypocalcemia. Yeah, I told you we'd get through these ones fast. Okay, so hypercalcemia, it's above 10.5 milligrams per deciliter. And that is the opposite. That means that we are less likely to get these excitable tissues moving. So what we're most worried about is the heart, because that's life-threatening. So what it says is mild hypercalcemia, first thing it does is it causes increased heart rate and blood pressure. But severe or prolonged calcium imbalance depresses electrical conduction and slows the heart rate. That tells us if we see that slowing heart rate, that's more of an issue. So I would be like super cautioned, decreased heart rate. That would be a priority assessment for me to see if it's worsening. And then alongside that, hypercalcemia allows blood clots to form more easily. So that's going to be a problem. So when we have more blood clots, like that's a problem. So blood clotting. Blood clots. That's a problem. So what we're worried about there is probably like a DVT. So I'm just going to draw we're worried about like swelling and a DVT and a clot in the leg. Neuromuscular changes include severe muscle weakness and decreased reflexes. So we have sad muscles again. Muscles. Which means, again, we're at a fall risk. And intestinal changes, we've got decreased movement. And so that could, present itself as nausea, vomiting, distension, pain, hypoactive bowel sounds. We got to make sure that they're still moving, because if not, things could get really stopped up and then it's a problem. So that's my not moving bowel. Okay, so what are we going to do? So we're going to give them something to reduce calcium. Fun fact, lactated ringers contain calcium. So lactated ringers are an IV fluid. So I'm going to put that here. Lactated ringers has calcium. So if we have too much calcium, then we're going to stop giving them lactated ringers because that's increasing it. Okay. And then after that, we are going to give them saline. That's a fun fact. Give saline. So it says that sodium increases kidney excretion of calcium. So sodium helps us get rid of calcium. So we're going to give them saline to help get rid of calcium. That's a fun, effect of our body. All right. And we're going to stop giving thiazide diuretics because they hold on to calcium. We're going to give them furosemide because it gets rid of everything. And then on top of that, we can give them calcium binders. Calcium binders. Because they'll bind to the calcium that's free in the blood and help lower that calcium level. Okay, so that's all for calcium. Let's move on to phosphorus. So our normal blood serum concentration of phosphorus is 3 to 4.5 milligrams per deciliter. And when we look at our overview of phosphorus, what does it do? It's needed for activating vitamins and enzymes, forming energy supplies, assisting in cell growth and metabolism. It also functions in acid-base balance and calcium homeostasis. And the fun thing about phosphorus is it's got a opposite reaction of calcium. So if our phosphorus is high, this is my scale. If our phosphorus is high, our calcium is low. And vice versa. If our calcium is high, then our phosphorus is low. They're opposites. So you can see if we have low phosphorus, we're going to have all of the problems that are associated with high calcium and vice versa. So for low phosphorus, what we got is the real kicker for low phosphorus is our cardiac changes. So I'm going to draw our heart. We're going to have decreased cardiac output and decreased stroke volume. Decreased cardiac output, decreased stroke volume. And then we have other changes. We have weak sad muscles. So again, you see how similar it is. Sad muscles. And it says if it's severe, we can start affecting our respiratory muscles as well. So our lungs, I'm going to draw them too. Respiratory problems. And then it's saying there can be chronic effects. So if you've had hypophosphatemia for a long time, it just hasn't been that severe, but it still affects bone density. So they would have decreased bone density, which means they could have, tiny fractures basically all over their body. And then they can also have central nervous system changes. That's not until it's really bad, but those include irritability to seizure to coma. So let me draw that. They can have seizures as well. So what we're going to do if they're low in phosphorus, we're going to give it to them. So the fun thing about phosphorus is it gives us specific guidelines. So we're not going to give it IV unless it's below 1 milligram per deciliter, which you look at the normal is 3 milligrams per deciliter. So we're not going to give it IV until it's 1 milligram per deciliter. So with that, I'm just going to write careful with IV phosphorus. And then we're going to have them talk to a dietitian to try and increase their intake of phosphorus. Okay, on to hyperphosphatemia. So hyperphosphatemia is when it's above 4.5 milligrams per deciliter. And it says high levels are well tolerated by most body systems. So pretty much it's not going to be a problem. The only time it becomes a problem if it leads to low calcium. So the main problem for hyperphosphatemia is going to be low calcium. And that's really it. It's pretty well tolerated. The main problem is just low calcium. So remember, those hyperexcitable membranes and potential cardiac changes, stuff like that. That's really all there is in the book for that. Okay, so moving on to magnesium. Okay, we are moving on to magnesium. And the most important thing about magnesium is that it is found in dark leafy greens. That's it. Okay. For low magnesium, that is when it is below 1.3 milliequivalents per liter. We are going to see excitability of the membrane. So again, that's going to be super hyperactive membranes. We're going to see some tingling, numbness, potentially could be seizures, all that fun stuff. But something that's different with magnesium is that when it's low, we're going to see the hyperexcitability of their membranes, but also decreased excitability of their intestines. Says that even can get a paralytic ileus, which means nothing's moving. So nothing's moving, which is really dangerous, and we want to keep an eye on that and make sure they're using the bathroom and passing bowel movements regularly. Okay. We're going to take a look at what drugs they're taking, particularly if they're taking any kind of diuretics. We're probably going to get off those. Boop. And something we can do to treat it is something called IV mag sulfate, which is MgSO4. And that's actually a really common drug we use when we're looking at labor and delivery. So I'm just going to make that little reminder of a little baby carriage. Okay. As a reminder there. And that's all we have for hypomagnesemia. Let's look at hypermagnesemia. All right, and for hypermagnesemia, we're going to see some cardiac changes. Let's draw the heart. And it also says we might see some EKG changes. So I'm going to go ahead and draw my little EKG. There's P, Q, R, S, T. Okay. So it says in our EKG changes, it might show a prolonged PR interval and a widened QRS complex. So let's draw what that looks like. Prolonged PR interval, so that's this thing, and widened QRS. Okay. Also, we're going to see some nervous system changes. Makes sense because we have decreased nerve impulse transmission. So in hypo, we saw everything was going crazy, possibility of seizures. Hyper is the complete opposite. Patients may be drowsy and may even slip into coma if it's elevated for too long or if it's just too high. We're also going to see some neuromuscular changes, and that could be the absence of the deep tendon reflex. So I'm just put a down arrow, down DTR. So we're going to be careful in checking those. So it says it has no direct effect on the lungs. However, when the respiratory muscles are weak, we may see some respiratory insufficiency, which can lead to respiratory failure and death. So that is something we should be aware of to check their respiratory system and see if those muscles are strong enough to keep them breathing. And to treat it, we're going to see if they're receiving any magnesium. So, if they're receiving any of these mag sulfate or any kind of oral supplement for magnesium, we're going to discontinue that. We're going to put them on diuretics to help, empty them out. And giving them some magnesium-free IV fluids to just help kind of dilute it a little bit and make the symptoms a little better. So I'm just going to put that IV fluids, diuretics. And just a fun fact, so if we're seeing cardiac problems, we can try giving them calcium to reverse the cardiac effects. So we can give calcium for the heart. Where'd my red go? I lost my red. For the heart. All right. And now we can move on to chloride. So chloride, there's not really much in it. Even in my book, there's only like 2 paragraphs on it. Mainly, it's just everything else going on, and then chloride's affected. Like, it's not that chloride's the main problem here. And so it says the main cause of chloride is caused by excessive vomiting or, GI suction for too long, and that its imbalance is usually corrected when we fix everything else. So honestly, for this one, I'm just going to kind of leave it blank. I'll just draw. We're aware of the gastric problem, and then it should fix itself. All right, and with that, we are done with the electrolytes. So we're moving on to fluid balance. So I did this a little out of order, kind of for a reason. So we're going to skip ahead to a page, and then we'll go back to that last one. So for fluid balance, it all starts with the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. So normally we have our fluid osmolality at 270 to 300 milliosmoles per liter, and we want a urine output of about 400 to 600 milliliters per day. So that's our normal. If we notice any changes, though, our kidneys are usually pretty good at adapting and making up for that. And so we can do that by recognizing a change in blood pressure, change in blood volume, change in sodium, or a change in oxygen. So that's when the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system kicks in. And so what happens is we have these, these key actors, angiotensin, aldosterone, renin, of course. So angiotensin has different forms. So when it's activated into angiotensin 2, it's a really strong vasoconstrictor, which means it's going to squeeze the blood vessels. And even though there's not an increase in blood volume, because there's less of a diameter for them to go through, it goes from like super, open, and suddenly we've squeezed it down to this little tube. We can keep up the blood pressure. So that's how they do that. So we constrict blood flow to the kidneys, decrease urine output, and we're going to increase the amount of water and sodium returned to the blood. So when that happens, we sense that, decrease in blood pressure, we compensate by constricting and increasing blood pressure. Then our body recognizes, hey, we're stressed. So we activate our stress glands, which are the adrenal glands, and they secrete aldosterone. And aldosterone goes into even more. It saves sodium and water, so it's going to increase the blood pressure that way by holding on to more sodium and more water. So that's how it's going to increase it back up. So altogether, it's a system. We're going to sense perfusion problem, and that yields the kidney release of renin, which shifts angiotensinogen into angiotensin 1, together with ACE becomes angiotensin 2, that vasoconstrictor, and then it affects blood pressure and volume by vasoconstriction and aldosterone secretion, and to maintain perfusion. So it's all in a system. So if you want to take any notes, you got some notes to take there, but that's pretty much your overview page. But to look back at the problems that happen when, we can't compensate, where we're beyond compensation, That's when we have hypovolemia and hypervolemia. All right, so first taking a look at hypovolemia, we should note that this just means that there's a low blood volume. So there's a different term, probably know as dehydration, and that's more of, everywhere is affected. And so they're very similar because, if you're dehydrated, you're likely to have a low blood volume as well. So both of these can occur without actually, losing fluid. So if we have something called relative hypovolemia or relative dehydration, that means something's happened to where the fluid's, shifted, and it's just somewhere where it's not supposed to be as the fluid shifts. So it's leaving the blood and it's going somewhere else, like third spacing. It's really common in burn patients. If we're usually third spacing happens in this abdomen is where we hide a lot of fluid. So burn patients, we want to check their abdomen and see, if there's any fluid hiding there, any abnormal weight gain, because that's a sign of water being hidden. Also, if there's like an injury, so trauma. Boop. Trauma, I'm just putting the causes here. Anything like that. Or if we're just not, getting enough. So like under intake. So we're not drinking enough, we're not eating enough. So probably one of the most important things when looking at fluids is looking at their daily weight. And so we're going to weigh them every day because 1 pound difference of weight is 500 milliliters difference of fluid. So that's good to know. So 1 pound of weight equals 500 milliliters of fluid, which can be a lot because if we're third spacing and that's somewhere where we don't want it to be, it can be putting a lot of pressure on internal organs. It can be causing a lot of problems. So we definitely want to be checking their weight. And then output, we're going to be, monitoring their output, make sure they're not losing too much. It could be some kind of kidney problem. So we're going to be looking at their kidneys. Let me draw those. Kidneys. We're going to be monitoring output. We're going to be checking what kind of medications they're taking, particularly diuretics, and, if they're taking any kind of laxative. Okay, and then what we're going to assess on them is going to be skin turgor. Oh, hi, cat. Oh, cat, that's... Go. Okay. Skin turgor, so that's when you pinch their skin. We're going to look and see if they're going to be tenting. So I'm going to draw a little tent. So hopefully we don't see that. So if you pinch the skin and it doesn't go back down, that basically means, okay, other cat. Both of your cats think this is fun. Okay, bye. The skin turgor, if we pinch it and it forms that little tent, then we know their skin is really dry and they're dehydrated. It's going to be easier to see in our older patients especially. And something else to know in our older patients is when they get dehydrated, they start to get a little crazy. So I'm going to draw, they're getting a little weird, and mentally we can see, a lot of neurological changes. We might see an increased respiratory rate and an increased heart rate because, again, we're making up for that loss of fluid. Yeah, so we're going to see those changes because decreased blood volume is going to decrease the amount of oxygenation and just perfusion in general. So we're going to see those changes to the respiratory rate and the heart rate. And mainly we're going to try and replace their fluids orally. We like to go least invasive first. We like to go least invasive first. So that means we're going to try it orally, and then, if they can't, swallow well, we're going to try and do it, IV fluids. And so the interesting thing about dehydration is we see all these different causes. Their electrolytes could be normal, could be high in relationship to the low water volume, or their electrolytes, could be low as well if they were lost, because of trauma. So fluid volume and electrolytes definitely works together, because like you can see, this is why this is like this. For especially their potassium and sodium, how we treat their sodium loss in relationship to their fluid volume is very different. We've already talked about, in particular, how hypovolemia and hypervolemia are going to change how we treat that. So it's all connected when we're looking at fluids and electrolytes. How we treat any electrolyte imbalance is going to be in relationship to their fluid balance as well. So let's continue to hypervolemia. So the thing for hypervolemia, the assessment that mainly we're going to see is they're going to be puffy. So they're going to be swollen with edema. Something called pitting edema is like when you press down on like their leg, it's going to like leave an imprint even after you move your finger. So we're going to see them being puffy. They're going to have all that extra fluid sitting on them. Okay. And so the main problem with this, I keep an eye on, is if they have all of this fluid volume overload, we're worried about their heart and their lungs, because that fluid might be going and sitting on those sensitive organs and causing more problems. Especially because if they're having fluid volume overload, they probably have another condition going on, probably kidney problems, not being able to drain everything out as normal. But that can lead to, pulmonary problems. It can lead to cardiac problems, heart failure, pulmonary edema, all that bad stuff. If we start getting our blood to the point where it's diluted, all of our electrolytes then became an issue as well, because they're all low in relationship to the amount of fluid that we have in our blood. So that can cause problems as well. And sometimes you might not be able to see that they're holding onto fluids. So that's why, again, we got to check their daily weight. Because 1 pound of weight is about 500 milliliters of fluid. So where did that fluid end up? We don't know. It's important to keep an eye on their weight. Another thing is we're going to check urine output and make sure they are peeing, because that's how we're going to get it off. So we've probably got them on diuretics, and we're checking their electrolytes to make sure that those are okay too. So I'm going to say we're on meds, we're on diuretics. We're listening to heart sounds, we're listening to lung sounds, because again, we don't want that fluid to end up there. So I'm going to go ahead, hi cat again. Their heart and their lungs, making sure those are all in good shape and there's not too much, edema around those. And just on top of that, I know we have already wrote we're going to check urine output, but we're also going to check that in relationship to intake too. So we're going to measure how much water they're taking in and how much is going out, and making sure that it's not staying instead of going out. Okay, and how I like to think about those two is, if you know the little short film from Disney called Boundin. You know how you have the jackalope and he's all fluffy and puffy and he's bounding everywhere? Well, that's our hypervolemia guy, because we're going to see those bounding pulses. Ha! I did a pun. So bounding pulse. And he's the fluffy little jackalope. I don't know how to draw a jackalope, but we'll try. Boop. He's a fluffy jackalope who's bounding. And this guy, hypovolemia, would be the tiny little sheep who's all scrawny, really weak. We're worried about that orthostatic hypotension, just worried about the blood pressure. They're going to be a little out of it. So it's like the little scraggly sheep. So if that's the mental relationship that I think about when I see a patient who's going to have hypervolemia, reminds me of that giant fluffy jackrabbit, versus hypovolemia, it's that little weak little sheep. So there's that. I think that is it for this section. To end it on that note, I hope this was somewhat helpful in going over the material. I know it's not everything, it's not really meant to be everything, it's just what I thought would be important and a way to show you how to kind of draw out your doodles on these charts. So with that, have a great rest of your day.